So I'm going to end up making this video into a podcast probably. So you're just kind of like the ride-along person with me. I'm in my husband's car right now because, and it needs gas apparently. And so I'll get some on the way home. And because he's working on my new car, my replacement car, because my old car crashed. The Forester got into a crash and the insurance company totaled it out. And then with the money from being totaled, I bought an Outback, same year, Forester Outback, for several $1,000s less than what the payout was for the total car, which I thought was a real bargain. Except that it's having some like coolant, radiator, some kind of problem. So my husband is a guy who will fix things himself. He'll wrench on cars really well. He knows what to do to diagnose things and then swap out parts and stuff. So he's a good car surgeon for that. So he's taking care of that. I'm driving his car. I don't know why it matters, but it just looks different than what you might have seen me in before. Anyway, I was just at Tally's greenhouse, and now is a perfect time to buy perennials, to replace perennials, to divide perennials that you have in the garden. If there's too many in one area and you want to divide them up, it's a perfect time to do it in the fall. I would say you can do it in the spring, except that one, you have to wait for the plants to come in. So they don't always, the nurseries don't always stock the perennials that you're looking for right away in the spring when the ground is ready to work. So if you can get them right now and put them in, if you can divide them up right now, you'll have less to have to do in the springtime when everyone's got the winter crazies and they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off, like trying to get plants in and trying to tidy up the yard and all that kind of stuff. You'll already have your perennials managed, your perennials in. You'll already have them in the design that you want, in the correct spacing and things like that. And they will have had the fall rains and cool season and the winter milder times underground to grow roots and get more established. And bonus, they're on sale right now. Perennials are on sale, at least at Tally's in Shelby Township. You can get them between 20 and 50% off, depends on what they are. Now, some people who are newer to gardening, maybe they're only vegetable gardening and fruit gardening and they don't know what necessarily a perennial is. Well, a perennial is something that comes back every year. If you are a vegetable gardener, you know your strawberries, well, that's fruit, I know, but your strawberries come back every year, your asparagus comes back every year, your orchard trees come back every year. Those are perennials. So with a perennial plant, basically the foliage and the top, at least in Michigan, in southeast Michigan, almost all the foliage on the top, and this is like for flowers, almost all that foliage on top dies back in the wintertime. And in the spring, you can just cut them right off to the ground and put that stuff in the compost pile. But you leave them up over the wintertime, and that gives insects some homes and some space to overwinter. It gives the birds some seeds, gives them some refuge from the cold. Snow might form on the leaves and the stalks and flowers, and it might provide some shelter again for the birds and for overwintering insects and things like that. And then around, I don't want to say tax time, but maybe the end of April, because tax time is usually in the middle of April. So around the end of April is when you would go and cut everything back down to the ground. And as you cut perennial stems back to the ground, you might see that there's new growth coming up. I would expect to see new growth starting to come up, like right where those stems all meet. But in the meantime, you can cut everything back. You can refresh the soil with a layer of compost or manure as a mulch. And because they're perennials, they don't You don't pull them out every year and put them back in again every year. They're in the ground all the time. So whatever you are putting on the ground for them as nutrients, that's what they're going to get. So before you plant a perennial, you want to make sure the soil is really, really good for it. That you want to make sure the soil is loose enough that the roots can spread, but the soil is not so sandy that the water just runs right through. You need organic material to be able to suck the water in and keep it there so the roots can get to it and to get the nutrients. You don't necessarily want to plant in clay soil, totally clay soil, because the water will just kind of stay there. And what's real important with the water, besides the water going up the stems and into the leaves and stuff, yes, plants need water. But the water, when it goes through the ground, it also sucks oxygen down with it. So the roots need oxygen as well. So when you make holes in clay soil, if you don't leave space, like if you don't make the hole bigger than what the plant actually needs, then the roots cannot expand and the plant will stay stunted. And the plant might even die because it would get too much water and it would drown and it wouldn't get any oxygen. It's got too much water. So for perennials, make sure you're going to plant them in the right place and make sure the soil is the correct soil that they need. So if it's a full sun plant, plant it in full sun. If it's a shade plant like a hosta, plant it in shade or part shade. If you try to put a shade plant in a sunny place, it's going to struggle. It might not look as well. It might get diseased faster than if you put it in the shade where it belongs. So when you go shopping for plants at the nursery, don't just fall for the little flower and go, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. Read the labels. Read the labels. Read the labels. Look and see what kind of soil it prefers. If it says moist, don't put it somewhere sandy and hot and sunny. It's not going to do as well as if it's moist, in a moist soil. And if it's a moist soil plant, it typically is going to be like a part shade kind of plant anyway, because that soil tends to stay moister, tends to stay cooler. So those are perennials. And then annuals, those are the things you start from seed or you buy the starts at the nursery and they last for one growing season, and then sadly at the end of the growing season you cut them off at the soil level and toss the leaves, like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, watermelon, squash, anything that lasts one season, grows one season and then it's done, or the frost kills it off. That's called an annual. Because there are some people that only grow perennials and they have never grown annuals. And there's a place for both. There's a place for mixture of annuals and perennials. So, so those are two categories. One is just it lasts one season and it's done. Another category is the perennials that come back every year. The tops die off in the wintertime. You cut them down in the spring and then they rebloom and they do their thing again in the growing season, which is amazing. Like I think about my native asters in the front yard. It's amazing how much growth they put on every season. And then there's a thing called a biennial, which that means the first year it's only leaves and then the second year it's like flowers. And then it dies off or it reseeds around there. Biennial. So it's like every other year it would bloom, but when the new plants come back, it's usually actually because they're reseeded from the old plants. Then there's annuals that will just reseed freely, like a cosmos or a zinnia. The seeds form, they grow really fast in the summertime, and the seeds form really quickly, and there you go, good. The seeds form very quickly. They're typically spread by birds. Another one would be like a sunflower. That's definitely reseeder. Pump out of order. Bummer. All right, can't use that one. And those are the kinds of plants that you'll find like as volunteers. You'll be like, oh, I don't remember planting a cosmos here. Well, you didn't. That's because it was happy enough to grow and reproduce itself right there in the particular area. And so that's an annual that reseeds. You can get that as well with like cilantro, lettuces, kales. Those will reseed as well, and you don't have to do a lot of the work. You can get that with tomatoes sometimes as well, because shoot, his car, I don't know. Let's see. You get that with tomatoes. You can get that with squash, where they're so happy growing where they are that they just want to keep growing there. Your environment is so good that they say, hey, we like this, and they just want to keep doing it. Yes. Put the pin out. Probably not the right pin. It is not the right pin. Okay. Oh, I took it out. Left hand begin feeling. I will do that. Alright, so in case you missed it the first time, annuals come once a year. They might reseed, some of them do, and then some you have to restart every time. Perennials, you're going to put in the ground once. That's their home. So whatever the environment is that you put them in is how they're going to stay unless you amend it. And you can amend the soil before you even put them in with like compost manure. And then there's the biennials, and then there's definitely the reseeders. And so what I wanted to say is there is a place for everything. So, for example, let's say you want to make a new pollinator garden, which is wonderful. If you wanted to use perennials, so you don't have to keep replanting every year. That's the beauty of perennials, is you don't have to keep planting them every single year. You put them in once, you cut them down in the spring, they grow back and they're happy. You enjoy them, they die off in the winter again, you cut them back in the spring, they grow back again, you're happy with them and they're happy and everyone's happy. Those are perennials. Versus annuals, or bedding plants, if you've heard that before, where you're buying the flats in the spring, you're putting them in the garden, and then in the fall you're digging them out and throwing them away, or you're throwing away hanging baskets or whatever. So here's a couple things. One is that if you decided to go for perennials, let's say you say, I want a flower garden, not necessarily a wildflower garden, because people say, oh, I want to scatter seeds. No, let's not go that way. Let's say I want a perennial garden that will attract pollinators and is relatively low maintenance. Okay, so you would, gonna get my, yes, I would like a receipt, thank you. You would go to the store, the nursery, and you would buy your plants, and you can buy them in small containers, like 4-inch containers. They're going to take longer to develop. You can buy them in giant, like 3-gallon containers, which you'll get instant color, but they're harder to get established because they are so large. They're used to living a certain way, kind of like adults in a move. So they're used to living a certain way in a certain environment, and so if you try to put them in the ground, they'll live, but you got to pay more attention to them. The smaller ones, they'll live, they just take longer to grow up. So your initial investment is low cost-wise, but you have to wait longer to see more things of beauty. Now the pollinators don't care, they're going to come anyway. But if you get middle of the road size, like gallon size, those are the better ones to start with. You also need to, again, look at the tags for planting. So when you buy perennials, and you're going to buy the ones for the pollinators, look at the tags and see how tall will they get, because that's going to make a difference. If you don't want a ground cover that only gets, you know, three inches, but it spreads out, or you don't want something that's like 8 foot tall like a sunflower or like pampas grass, you need to read the labels to make sure. If you don't have space, maybe you want a butterfly bush, which is kind of a shrub, but it's still a pollinator attracting plant. If you only have, you know, 3 feet of space, you're not going to want to get the big, huge butterfly bushes that are going to really take over and then crowd everything else out. So you have to look to see how much space is this plant going to need. Not how much space do I have right now, but how much space is this plant going to need, and then plan accordingly. So if you read a tag and it says, if it says width, you know, 24 to 36 inches, that's 2 to 3 feet. So if you plant the plant here, you're going to have to measure out 1.5 feet on either side. That's 3 feet there. That's the potential growth width. And then make sure that the next plant you plant has enough space to make its full potential. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you plant, I'm not going to put this finger down, but if this is the only plant you plant, and then you're like, oh, I got another plant, I'm going to put it right next to it. No, because there's too much space in between. I don't like all the space in between. No, you can't. You can't just shove them together, because they're not going to have the room they need to grow. You have to think about how wide will they grow, what does it say on the tag, use the maximum width, divide it in half, and then make sure that you've got that much space in between the plants so they can all grow happily. They can touch. They could even kind of press against each other a little bit. But if you don't have enough space for them and they're all crowded together, you're going to have to go in and divide them anyway. Why would you want to do that? Like, that's not lazy gardening method. So make sure that you think ahead when you're planning out what you want to put in if you're going to do it yourself. Now, if you want me to come to you and figure out your space and figure out how many plants you could put in where so they don't get too crowded, you can do that. That's an option, because that is something that I do for people who want beauty and they don't know how to get it, and they don't know how to do it without, I don't know. It's something I can help you with. So spacing, make sure you know about spacing. Oh, so when you go to plant your perennials, maybe you're like, there's these 2 little perennials, maybe there's 7 little perennials, and there's like so much space all around them. That's okay, because the trick with perennials is when you first put them in, the first year, they sleep. They're sleeping. The second year they grow, they creep. That means their roots are just starting to kind of go out into the soil. They're taking their time growing. They're getting to know their neighbors, and they're just creeping. But by the 3rd year, they want to have a party and they leap. And so you might have been adding perennials and adding perennials and adding perennials. You're like, I don't know what's going on. But if you've been doing it for several years, suddenly your plants are just going to take off. And they're all going to want the space that you have, whatever space you have. But in the meantime, that first year and that second year is a great time. So if you've got a bunch of perennials all growing and there's spaces in between them and you're like, I don't want to see all the ground, fine, you don't have to. That's where you can put your annuals and bedding plants in between to cover the ground. And when you cover the ground, you are keeping the soil cool, you are keeping the soil moist, you are helping catch rainwater, you are providing habitats for insects that are beneficial, and birds and mice, and everything up the food chain is going to thank you for doing that. And you'll have less weeds. Less weeds. We like less weeds, right? Who wants to pull weeds? I don't want to pull weeds. I don't even pull my own weeds, really, until they really annoy me too much. Then I got to pull them. And I definitely don't like to pull other people's weeds. So that is one way to beat it. So those first 2 years, you could easily, if you've got a perennial, pollinator garden, you could easily find some annuals to put in between the spaces that will fill in those spaces really, really well until the perennials grow in. And then once the perennials grow in, they're going to be like so close to the other perennials, there's not going to be sunlight and warmth for weed seeds to grow. Another bonus, right? Again, we don't want to pull weeds. We don't want to make environments that are good for weeds. We want to cover the soil. And so especially if you don't like to see the spaces in between the plants, consider putting in annuals around your perennials. Think carefully about what size those annuals grow, though. Make sure that there's flashing lights on my way home. I hope it's not at my house. Let's see what happens. Make sure that whatever annual you decide to put in there isn't rude and going to grow all over your perennials. So one year I put in the front up by my mailbox, I had put in coneflower and black-eyed Susan and the asters and some shrubs and some natives, and there was a lot of space in between my perennials. I was like, okay, that's cool. Well, I'm going to put in these little mounds of pumpkins and squash, and I think there might have been something else, but mostly pumpkins and squash. And it was just like 3 seeds in a small mound. Oh, I might not be able to make it through here. 3 seeds in a small mound, and they went crazy. They went absolutely crazy, and I regularly had to cut back the vines in order to save those perennials I had planted. So think ahead about how much space they're gonna need. But you could do low growing perennial or annuals in between the spaces, and again covering the soil. If you don't put plants, then put wood chips. If you don't put wood chips, then put compost, like mulch with 2 or 3 inches of composted manure. Whatever you can do to cover the soil. Maybe you use grass clippings if they're not like the kind that's got like the herbicides on them. If you don't spray your lawn, you can use those grass clippings and put them in between the spaces. Whatever you can do to cover those spaces is going to work out well for you. So anyway, annuals, perennials, biennials, free seeding, sizes. See if you can also, if you go to the nursery, like now, because the plants are on sale, guys. I don't know how many times I might say that this today even, but the perennials are on sale. So if you happen to go to the nursery and start buying perennials that are on sale, make sure that you group them together as far as their needs go. So if you see some that are water loving, put them all together. If you see some that are shade loving, or not shade loving, but dry loving, they like dry conditions, put them all together. All that kind of stuff. So they will grow together. So when you go to water, you're not going to have to water, an individual plant based on its need. You're going to water a section based on its need. So if it's really moist, you're going to water it longer. If it needs it really dry, you're barely going to water, but you know that that whole section is going to be treated about the same thing. So anyway, just a little bit of flower type education to you. Excuse me. And like I said, I'm going to probably put this in a podcast form so you don't have to look at my hot, sweaty face in this silly car. And I hope you guys learn and grow, and learn and grow some more. This is Tammy Lowe, the Lazy Northern Gardener. And if you like what I had to say, then click the like. If you want to share it, feel free. If you want to get more, then go ahead and subscribe and share with your friends. Love you guys, and enjoy your day.